is $7.25 an hour. The current federal minimum wage is a starvation wage. It's got to be raised to a living wage.
In this video, I'm going to lay out my objection to increasing the federal minimum wage. There's a famous quote by Bastiat that goes, "Every time we object to a thing being done by government, the socialists conclude that we object to its being done at all," end quote. And that applies here. I don't object to a minimum wage in principle, but I do object to a minimum wage being set at the federal level. The reason for this is fairly obvious. There are many different living conditions in the United States. San Francisco, for example, is a very expensive city, and it's expensive even if you make $20 an hour. Compare that to Memphis, Tennessee, on the other hand, which is not a very expensive city. $20 an hour in Memphis, Tennessee would put you above the minimum household income, assuming you were to work full time. So the question is, what should the federal minimum wage be set to? Should it be set to provide a comfortable life in New York City or in Memphis, Tennessee, or rural Arkansas? It just doesn't make any sense. It's inconsistent. And if you set it to apply to one place, it won't work well in another. So many arguments about the minimum wage tend to come at it from the perspective of, will it create jobs? And it might create jobs because poor people spend a larger proportion of their income, and therefore if poor people get more money, then more money will be spent, and that economic activity will generate new jobs. On the other hand, increasing the minimum wage might make it so that any worker who doesn't generate enough value to their employer to justify the increased wage would have to be fired, and that might eliminate jobs. Given that there are these disparate conditions across the United States, why set minimum wage at the federal level? Why not at the city or state level? Cities or states that are more expensive to live in can have a higher minimum wage, and cheaper cities or states can have a lower minimum wage. Bernie Sanders recognizes that this is already being done at the state level, so why not continue?
Cities, states are beginning to understand that we need a minimum wage, which is a living wage. And you are the people who started that ball rolling. Woo! Woo, woo, woo. Sure. Seattle did it. Los Angeles did it. New York City has done it. And it's time for the federal government to do it. Yay!
The federal government doesn't have to do everything. Many problems are better solved by groups closer to the problem. I think the people who are most qualified to determine what or whether the minimum wage should be in New York City are the legislators that the people of New York City have elected to represent them at the state or city level, and likewise for Memphis and all other places. The smaller the group that makes the decision, the more likely it will be to satisfy the needs of the people within that group. Organizing the minimum wage at the local level means that the people of New York City or San Francisco can live comfortably and get a minimum wage that makes sense for them. But it also means that employers in Memphis or similar places don't have to bankrupt themselves paying extremely high wages. So let's go ahead and take a look at some arguments in favor of raising the federal minimum wage, and these arguments come from a professor at UC Berkeley named Robert Reich. He's going to explain why we should raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Had the minimum wage of 1968 been adjusted for inflation, it would be well above $10 an hour today. But the typical worker today is also more than twice as productive as then. Adjusted for both inflation and productivity gains, therefore, the minimum wage should be at least $15 an hour.
Increasing the minimum wage based on inflation is a good argument if you think that minimum wage was set correctly initially. This would be a good argument to increase the federal minimum wage slightly and to make it track with inflation. However, it doesn't refute my earlier challenge to minimum wage, which is why does it need to be done at the federal level as opposed to the city or state level? Productivity has increased, but that doesn't mean we need to increase wages. Consider McDonald's employees of 50 years ago and the employees of today. McDonald's employees of today are much more productive than their counterparts in the past. But why is that? Are today's workers harder working, smarter, faster, etc.? Productivity has much more to do with increased technology. A modern McDonald's worker has a computer with an easy-to-use touchscreen to enter orders, communicate the orders to chefs, and calculate and dispense change. Modern McDonald's benefits from machines that can automatically fill sodas. Monitoring tools and electronic implements allow different procedures to be tested, rigorously measured, modified, and adopted. Self-service kiosks and orders from mobile apps can improve efficiency even further. So why should workers be paid more just because other people have invented technologies or patterns to make them more efficient, and their employers have invested money in those tools and technologies?
$10.10 an hour is not enough to lift all workers and their families out of poverty. This is especially true for millions of low-wage workers who want full-time jobs but can only work and find part-time work.
As mentioned before, this depends on where you are. $10 may not be a lot in San Francisco, but it might be quite sufficient in some poorer areas of the country. Why not let city and state governments decide what the minimum wage should be?
Because some employers now pay wages that don't lift their employees out of poverty, the rest of us pay for their Medicaid, food stamps, housing, and other assistance.
Some companies like McDonald's and Walmart typically have employees that have to use programs like food stamps and welfare in addition to their minimum wage job. One way of looking at this is that the taxpayer is subsidizing McDonald's, but another way of looking at it is that McDonald's is subsidizing the taxpayer. In other words, if the McDonald's employee weren't working at McDonald's and making some money, then they would need even more money and services in government assistance. Either way you look at it, it doesn't change the argument I outlined above, which is that minimum wage doesn't need to be set at the federal level to solve this.
Some jobs may be lost if the minimum is raised to $15, but many more people will be lifted out of poverty.
This argument may have some merit to it, but different places around the country have different conditions. In some places, I have no doubt that raising the minimum wage would help the local economy and create jobs. In other places, raising the minimum wage may be an undue burden. This seems like a decision that states and major cities are better qualified to make. There is no reason to do this at the federal level.
Such a wage increase is more likely to come out of profits than be passed on in higher prices.
It's hard to see how this could be generally true for all industries which employ low-wage workers. If these industries were in such intense competition that they couldn't stand to increase their prices on their customers, then there wouldn't be large pools of profits for them to cut. An extremely competitive market is a market where firms have very little profit. If there is intense competition, then there can't also be lots of profit to cut. Regardless of which analysis is right, there are many industries and many environments across the country. Even if this argument made sense somewhere, that doesn't mean it makes sense everywhere. This is still not an argument in favor of the federal minimum wage. Different areas and industries require different legislation to achieve an equitable outcome. So why not empower different areas to make legislation that's right for them? Robert's sixth argument is that it's better politics to ask for more, to ask for a $15 minimum wage, and then bargain to get something you can live with. However, this argument is predicated on the idea that federal minimum wage is a good thing, and as I've argued, it's not. If it were a bad idea, then using a bargaining tactic to increase the minimum wage would just be using a rhetorical trick to get more of a bad thing, and that's actually not that good at all. The seventh and final argument that I'll cover here is an argument in favor of wealth redistribution. Robert Reich suggests that increasing the minimum wage will result in a more equitable distribution of wealth. That is, it'll take money away from the richest people and give more money to the poorest people. Now, in some cases, this may be true, as I discussed earlier. Raising the minimum wage may result in poor people getting more money and there being more jobs for poor people and so on. In other cases, it may not be true. It might result in a net loss of jobs, and a net loss of jobs would not result in an improved distribution of wealth. So why not allow the decision regarding minimum wage to be made at the state or local level, where informed legislators acting with the consent of a small group of people can make the choices that are right for them? If you enjoyed this video, and since you're still watching, I suspect you did, why don't you go ahead and click the like button. If you're interested in more content in a similar style, check out my other videos and click subscribe. Thanks for your time.